Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden says he is not seeking conflict with Russia ahead of his highly anticipated meeting with Vladimir Putin later this week. But Mr. Biden also warned that the United States would respond if Russia continued what he said were, quote, harmful activities. The comments came after Mr. Biden met with the leaders of several countries during a NATO summit in Belgium. The president continued to emphasize America's role on the world stage and highlighted the importance of NATO's military alliances. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes is traveling with the president and begins our coverage.
The leaders of the 30 NATO countries, including President Biden, issued a warning about Russia today, just ahead of the Biden-Putin summit. In a joint communique, the NATO leaders gathered here in Brussels said Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Have any of the world leaders you've met with this week expressed concern that by meeting with President Putin this early in your presidency, that it'll look like you're rewarding him?
Every world leader here as a member of NATO that spoke today, and most of them mentioned it, thanked me for meeting with Putin now. Every single one that spoke.
President Biden said he'll confront Putin Wednesday about his invasion of neighboring Ukraine, about cyber attacks on U.S. companies by Russia-based hackers, and about the poisoning and jailing of prominent Russian dissidents like Alexei Navalny.
Such decisions in this country are not made by the president. They're made by the court.
In an interview with NBC News, Putin refused to guarantee Navalny's health and safety.
The person that you have mentioned, the same kind of measures will apply, not in any way worse than to anybody else who happens to be in prison.
I asked President Biden what it would mean for the U.S.-Russia relationship if Navalny were to die in prison.
It would be a tragedy. It would do nothing but hurt his relationships with the rest of the world, in my view, and with me.
And Nancy Cordes joins me now from Brussels. Hi there, Nancy. So you mentioned some of the issues President Biden is expected to confront Vladimir Putin on. The president is not saying much about his meeting, but what would a successful outcome look like for President Biden?
You know, he and the White House more broadly have been very careful, Elaine, not to overpromise, not to try to claim that they're going to come out of this meeting with any concrete accomplishments whatsoever. And that makes it a little unusual for presidential summits. Typically, going into almost any meeting, whether it's one-on-one or a larger summit like the NATO summit that we're attending here in Brussels, a lot of it is thought out beforehand, and the leaders emerge with a communique or some kind of list of agreements that have been worked out in advance. Obviously, this meeting in Geneva is going to be nothing like that. The president is going into that meeting, he says, ready to express his concerns about a variety of topics, ready to say that that there are several areas where he feels that he can work together with Putin. But in terms of what he expects to come out of that particular meeting, he and other White House officials have said they don't really know if anything will come out of that one meeting. They just hope that it will start a dialogue, perhaps turn the page with Vladimir Putin, set the stage for more cooperation, less confrontation going forward.
Because, Nancy, a number of U.S. presidents have attempted to manage relations with Russia with varying degrees of success. What are some of the challenges facing the Biden administration in its relationship with Russia and Vladimir Putin?
I think one of the biggest challenges is that Putin doesn't even acknowledge that the Russian government or that individuals inside Russia have done the things that they're being accused of doing. So President Biden, for example, is going to confront Putin about cyber hacking by individuals who are inside Russia, not necessarily part of the Russian government, but at least being given safe harbor there. Putin said in a recent interview, there's no proof of that. He's only heard the accusation, but there's no proof. He he doesn't admit interfering in the 2016 election. He claims that Alexei Navalny, who's been poisoned, is going to be treated just like anyone else, even though we know that there have been points when he's been close to death in prison. And so that makes it very difficult to make much progress on these issues when you're coming face to face with a leader who doesn't even acknowledge the things that he's done, the things you say he's done.
Right. Well, President Biden also met with Turkey's president on Monday, as well as the leaders of several other NATO members. What are some of the key issues the world leaders are hoping to address?
Well, they talked a great deal about Afghanistan. That's something that came up in President Biden's conversation with Turkey, because while Turkey has been something of a fair weather friend when it comes to the NATO alliance, it does have a role to play in security in Afghanistan as a lot of NATO forces led by the U.S. start to pull out of Afghanistan by September 11th. So that was a big topic of conversation, and how they continue to secure Afghanistan from afar, whether that's even possible, how they train Afghan security forces once the NATO troops have gone. So that was a big topic of conversation. Another big topic of conversation, China. You know, China has historically not been a big topic of concern for NATO. This is an Atlantic alliance, after all, and China's on the other side of the world. But the leaders of these countries, these 30 countries, have been getting more concerned as they see China's military expanding rapidly and conducting exercises with the Russian military. And so today, in a somewhat unprecedented move for NATO, they issued their standard communique, and it included some tough language about China. They said that the country's assertive behavior presents challenges to the rules-based international order. So the growing unease among NATO allies about China being reflected in that statement.
Really fascinating to see this evolving nature here of this alliance. Nancy, overall, how have President Biden's interactions with world leaders at the G7 and NATO summits differed from those of his predecessor? What tone is the Biden administration trying to strike?
I mean, I don't think that they could possibly be more different. At every turn, President Biden himself, other world leaders, the White House have all said America is back. It's cooperating again with its transatlantic allies. President Biden went to pains in this press conference to talk about how important NATO is, how vital it is, how committed America is to NATO. President Trump, on the other hand, often argued that the NATO countries were creating huge problems for the U.S. and that they weren't paying their fair share. And he went over after G7 allies, too. So clearly, President Biden is looking to turn the page here. And based on what we've heard, not just from him, because, of course, he'll say it's going great, but what we've heard from other world leaders who, have been embracing him, who say they're so glad that they've got a U.S. government that is more predictable, that they can work with, that is that doesn't seem to shift around as much in its stances. There's clearly a sense of relief among the world leaders that we've seen meeting with President Biden over the past week or so.
All right, Nancy Cordes traveling with the president in Brussels tonight. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.